evening, everybody. My name is Chinedu Nwafili. Trying to adjust this mic. I'm going to hold it. All right. And today we'll be talking about skeletal animation in your browser via WebGL. So just as a quick background for anyone who might not be familiar with WebGL, WebGL is technically a 2D, but for all intents and purposes, a 3D API in JavaScript that lets you make graphics in your browser. And so, okay, skeletal animation. In a nutshell, skeletal animation is a technique for taking a bunch of points on your screen and sort of moving them around in 3D space, positioning them, having them orient themselves to represent some type of animation. So as you can see here, there's a guy moving. He is being skeletally animated. If you've ever played a video game or watched a movie or watched a cartoon or did anything sort of colorful that wasn't real people, that was probably skeletal animation. And so just to sort of preface, we're not going to dive into much of the math that powers this or the lower level details of it. Hopefully we'll all walk away with just a higher level understanding of how skeletal animation works. And if we do, then that's a thumbs up. So, all right, let's start diving in. So skeletal animation is made up of poses. So if any of you were alive in the 70s and you went out and did, I think they did the row in the 70s, maybe not, I wasn't born then. But if any of you were around in the 70s or 80s and did the robot, you remember hitting sort of a bunch of poses. That's essentially how skeletal animation works. So if we freeze time randomly now, that would be a pose. It's all the points in one place at one particular point in time, right? And then, oops. And then so if we start again and quickly stop and keep doing that, we'll be in different poses. And again, a pose is just a bunch of points at a given time, all in certain places. And when you put that all together, it looks like you're, I guess, standing with your feet apart or standing with your feet together or doing something. So if we kind of quickly click, you'll see different poses. So what's really happening here is, as time goes on, a bunch of different poses are being shown. But if we let it sort of play out, your eye tells you that there's motion, even though there isn't. So imagine me clicking sort of very quickly. We'd be moving through all of these poses very quickly, and that's effectively what's happening when you have skeletal animation. Now again, that's probably, for some of you, maybe you already know skeletal animation. For others, that's a bunch of stuff maybe you've never seen before. So let's start from the bottom here, build our way up, and get a better sense of how that works. So our man with a hat, we'll call him, has 700 different points. So we talked about skeletal animation being a bunch of different points, all at different places at different times. And so this guy has 700 of them. So as you can imagine, someone has to say that those points go somewhere at a certain time. And I would imagine that no one has time to individually place all 700 of his points at every place that you want it. And so we'll need a different system to handle this and make sure that a guy with a hat can be in the right place at the right time. And so in order to understand that, let's start a little smaller with a cube, with about 8. But first I'm going to press the start button, which I was supposed to press before. All right, so we have a cube. There are 8 points. And like we talked about before, at any given time, those 8 points need to be somewhere. And again, this is really easy because it's 8, not 700. So we could just say, at time 0, put them here. At time 1, put them here, et cetera, et cetera. So to quickly sort of illustrate that, if we take this slider, and there's like an amount of time, the cube will be at a different place at these different times. And we're saying, okay, you 8 points, I want you here at 5 seconds, here at 6 seconds, here at 7. And when you sort of combine all of that, you get the smooth motion in between. That's regular animation. And again, really easy with 8 points, wouldn't work for the 720 that we saw before. So how do we get around that? All right, that's where skeletal animation comes in. So the big change here is that instead of us going in and saying, all right, you 8 points, go here at this time and here at this time and be at this pose at this time, we're instead saying, you 8 points, I want you to follow this controller. So when this little spear controller, we'll call it, moves left, I want you guys to move left. When it moves right, I want you guys to move right. When little controller says jump, I want you to say how high, et cetera, et cetera. And so, same thing as before. If we started at 0 seconds and had our controller there, all 8 points will follow it. Move it at 1 second, 2 second, 3 second. Those 8 points do whatever their controller does. So now the advantage here is that instead of having to go through and move all 8 of those points whenever we want to move our cube that has 8 points, we can instead move our one controller. The 8 points have been assigned. Hey, you guys follow that one controller, so we can achieve what we want by just moving one thing instead of 8. So that works really great for 8 points, but again, we want to move these 720. And like you saw before, these 8 points are following one thing, but that definitely wouldn't give us a walk. It wouldn't give us any type of cool information and animation for our man with a hat. And so we need to move on to having not one controller, but 2. So this is a quick little prism, we'll call it, box, that has 2 controllers that control it. So as you can see, when this top one bends, the top of the cube bends, or rectangular prism. When the bottom of the controller bends, the second one down here, the bottom will kind of bend and slide along with it. And so as these controllers move, the vertices follow them, and that sort of starts building a slightly more complex animation. And so the actual coloring of this cube is slightly intentional. So here you see that the top of the cube, the 4 vertices up here are all red. I keep calling it a cube. It's a rectangle, but go with me. The top is all red. And so red signifies very heavily affected, and blue signifies we're not really listening to the controller. So for this top controller here, these points at the top that are red are listening to every single thing that it does and moving exactly with it. These bottom blue ones are sort of rebellious, I guess, and they're not following it. So if we look, you can see the top ones bend forward when our top cube bends forward, but the bottom ones don't, because they're not really paying attention to it. They're not controlled by it. However, those bottom points are actually following this bottom controller, so you can see when it tilts to the left, they'll tend to follow it. So that sort of illustrates that with your skeletal animation, you can have some of your points following some joints, some bones, or controllers, whatever you want to call them, and then other vertices or points will be following other controllers. And so going back to our man with a hat, so we know that we don't want to move all these vertices by hand because none of us have the months that it might take. And we know that we can't use one controller because that just wouldn't let us move all these vertices in different ways. So instead, we'll kind of apply what we just learned and use multiple controllers for him. And so we have man with a hat, 700 vertices, don't want to move them by hand. But what we can move by hand is 18 different controllers or bones. And so in a tool such as Blender or 3D Studio Max or Maya, these are some free, some extremely expensive tools that you can use to move these 18 bones around just by pointing and clicking pretty easily. So in a tool like that, we'll move these, and we'll tell our model from before to follow them. The hat might follow the ones up here, the legs might follow the ones up here. And then when you put it all together, you have your skeletal animation in your browser. And then, actually, I think that's it. Yeah, so if you're interested in 3D web stuff, I do a bunch of it. So let's do something together on Twitter or GitHub or something else. Thank you.